Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Autumn 2021 series of the Virtual Museum Lecture Series presented by the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Our community is filled with diverse stories, and we recognize that our story begins with the Indigenous peoples of this land. We acknowledge that we are broadcasting this lecture on lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous peoples for millennia, and we would like to honor the centuries of Indigenous peoples who walked on Turtle Island before us. My name is Adrian Petrie, and I'm the Visitor Services Coordinator here at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. Welcome back to the lecture series. We hope these lectures provide a bit of historical joy and also spark imagination and exploration into our city's rich history. If you're joining us for this first time, why not go back and view all the lectures that have been presented in the last 18 months almost. There are now over 20 lectures for you to enjoy. Just look for the playlist Virtual Museum Lecture Series on our YouTube channel. We are also happy to announce that the lecture audio is being added to our podcast. VMLS via podcast will help to share the lectures with an even wider audience. So if you're new, you can catch up via podcast, or you can go back and listen to your favorite lecture again and again. It'll be there waiting for you in the coming weeks. As we dive into some exciting history tonight, please feel free to make use of the chat, which I see some of you are. Hello, everybody. Make use of the chat box to ask questions and send comments. Also, if you have any tech issues, I'll be in the comments to help. We'll moderate the chat box during and at the end of the presentation. There is a slight delay in the broadcast. It's about a minute, actually. So if we do miss your question, we will get to it at the end. And as always, we have an exciting lineup for the fall series. Of course, tonight's lecture is very exciting, but next time, I'll take an opportunity to tell you about all the upcoming lectures as well. So you can mark your calendars, including 4 lectures, including on October 5th, we'll welcome special guest and local railroad historian, Andy Panko, to take us on a virtual train ride as we explore the rails, sidings, and rolling stock of the Welland Ship Canal Construction Railway, one of the busiest railways in Canada at the time of canal construction. On October 19th, oops, I'm going backwards. Sorry, wrong button. There we go. On October 19th, I will present Canada's Game in the Garden City, which will explore historical narratives and living memory about hockey in St. Catharines and what makes hockey so special and significant to so many in our community. I should note that if anyone has any fun memories, speaking of the living memory part of the lecture, if anyone has any fun memories or stories related to hockey, like going to a hockey game or playing in a hockey game in St. Catharines that they would like to see included in the lecture, please pass them along to me soon. That would be great. On November 2nd, we're happy to welcome special guest, local historian and chair of the city's Heritage Advisory Committee, Brian Nari, who is also in the chat box tonight and watching tonight. Hello, Brian. Brian will be here to discuss the early court system in St. Catharines starting in the 1780s and various court cases and records from early St. Catharines in his talk titled, this is our favorite title so far too, Woe Be to the Malefactors, Early St. Catharines Court Records. On November 16th, Sarah will use housing, suburban development, and sprawl as a lens to consider some of the major socioeconomic issues that face people in St. Catharines in the 20th century. By paying close attention to housing trends and issues in the city over time, we can gain a virtual insight into how big societal shifts impacted our community, from immigration to the Great Depression to the post-war boom and more. And Bookending the the lecture series this fall, Kathleen will be back on November 31st to explore when the world was plunged into war in 1914 and how everything changed. It'll actually be a good follow-up to tonight's lecture, I think. Just a few years difference between these topics. This lecture is a personal look at the First World War through the eyes and voices of those who lived this life-changing moment in time. And that is our autumn lecture series for 2021. We hope you'll join us for each and every one this fall. Of course, if you miss it, you can always catch it the next day. They're up on YouTube for you to enjoy. I'd like to take a moment to encourage you to make a donation to the museum in support of our programming. Your donations help us to continue to provide the high quality and enjoyable programming that you have come to expect from us. We really appreciate any donation you're able to make. Give us a call at 905-984-8880 during our operating hours to make a donation. And new this fall, you can now make a donation online via our ActiveNet portal. The link to the portal was included in our email reminder last week and this evening. Your donation makes a difference. Thank you. And now, kicking off our fall 2021 lecture series, please welcome everyone, our curator and supervisor of historical services, Kathleen Powell, with her lecture titled Adventures in Housekeeping, Edwardian Canadian Domestic Life.
Great. Thank you so much, Adrian. I'm just going to make sure that I have control of our PowerPoint slides. So thank you all for joining me this evening in this lecture called Adventures in Housekeeping. Hold on a second here. Adrian, I'm not able to change the slide. Oh, wait, I got it. Never mind. Okay. Sorry, everyone. Oh, now we're going too fast. There we go.
Sorry, Kathy, and I actually don't have any control.
It's okay. For some reason, it was like whipping through all the slides.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Have fun.
Now let's see if I can get this to work now. There we go. Okay, so as I said again, thank you all for joining me tonight in Adventures in Housekeeping. When you first saw the description of this presentation, it was that we will be talking about whether or not the rosy picture of the world in 1900 translated to domestic life in St. Catharines. And you'll see as we go through this that I will be talking about that somewhat. However, you will hear from me that 1900 Canada is probably one of the least researched and written about periods when it comes to domestic history for Canadian, for just history in general. And so it was very difficult to find a lot of sources that spoke to the personal experience of people who were living in that time. So the topic is a little bit broader, and but you'll see as we go along, hopefully it will still meet all of your needs to hear about what life was like for people in 1900 in St. Catharines. The idea for this lecture, Adventures in Housekeeping, came thanks to this huge tome that you can see in the picture here, and my favorite domestic goddess, Isabella Beaton, and her Victorian book of household management. This picture is actually a picture of my book. I'm lucky enough to own this 1912 copy of the book, which covers pretty much all things domestic life in the Victorian and Edwardian period. And reading through this book, which is over 2,000 pages, always made me wonder, what was domestic life like in St. Catharines in 1900, and how useful was Mrs. Beaton to the average household at that time? Because Mrs. Beaton was British, and Mrs. Beaton's book of household management is very British focused, but how much did that translate to domestic life here? But I'll tell you a little bit about Mrs. Beaton in case you're not familiar with her. But if you do want a deeper dive into Mrs. Beaton's book of household management, on our museum blog, www.stcatharinesmuseumblog.com. I've been doing a monthly series called My Year with Mrs. Beaton and exploring many different chapters through Mrs. Beaton's book and the things that she shares with her readers. Okay, I'm just going to try and see if we can get our slides to change here. There we go. Okay, so Isabella Mary Mason was the quintessential Victorian. She was actually born right on the cusp of the Victorian era in 1836 in London, England. Her father died when she was quite young, and her mother, who had already had several children, 3 years later remarried since it was so much trouble for her to take care of a large family on her own, and they moved the family to Surrey, England. Isabella was the oldest of the children, the eldest daughter in the family, and eventually the family grew to have 16 children. And Isabella spent most of her time caring for her siblings. In that time, she also went and did some schooling abroad, and she was very intelligent, fluent in French and German. She was a proficient piano player, and she had aspirations to do work as a chef, a pastry chef or something similar, and took courses in pastry making. Isabella's stepfather, who came in after, when she was a teenager, essentially, owned a horse racing track. And it turned out that Isabella and her siblings essentially grew up living at the track. They were at the track all the time. Their house was basically a part of it. And she took care of her siblings while the family basically ran the racetrack as well. And she learned through this all the skills that were needed to manage a large household as she helped to care for the large brood of siblings and this busy family. In 1856, Isabella married Samuel Orchard Beaton, who was a writer, an editor, and a journalist. Samuel Beaton was a newspaper and magazine publisher, and he published a bunch of different magazines, and Isabella got involved in the publishing business as well after she married Samuel. And she began writing for the English Woman's Domestic Magazine in 1857, and basically took on some of the more gendered content at the time, such as cookery and fiction for women. In 1859, the magazine began publishing a monthly series, which turned out to be 29 48-page supplements that were all written by Isabella Beaton about the topic of household management. The series was eventually published as a book. This book that you saw at the beginning, which I also have here, weighs a bit of a ton, but there it is, which is Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management. It didn't start as thick as the version that I have now. It was a little bit skinnier when it first started. It's been added to substantially over the years. When it was released in 1861, it originally had 1,112 pages. And in its first year, it was a huge success. It sold 60,000 copies, which is pretty impressive achievement for basically what was a household management and cookbook. Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management has remained in print since its original publication 160 years ago. In fact, you can actually still buy a modern printing of this book through many booksellers. If you were to go onto Amazon and put in Isabella or Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management, you would be able to find a modern printing of it. And you can also read the book in digital format for free on Gutenberg.org if you're looking for it, if you're interested. One of the appealing things about Mrs. Beaton's book was the in-depth coverage of all things domestic. This included such topics as how to manage your servants and your household accounts, what kitchen equipment you needed to properly manage a kitchen, recipes and recipes and recipes, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of recipes, how to manage the sick room, how to butcher different animals, and much, much more. Isabella Beaton also added quite a lot of history into the book. So lots of times when she's speaking of a specific type of food, she'll go back and speak to the history of how, basically how the English ended up with that particular food in their diet. The book also included a number of colored plates, which helped to illustrate each chapter, and in each new edition. And the editors ensured that all the pricing that was cited in each edition was current to the time period of the publication. And this book was specifically aimed at housewives who were responsible for the government of the household, with the aim of aiding wives who were required to compete with all those things that aimed to draw husbands outside of the home or outdoors. Mrs. Beaton is really aimed at the more upwardly mobile household as well, I should say. It is unlikely that someone who was in the lower classes would have picked up a copy of Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management and really used it in any real useful way, except for perhaps some of the recipes. Mrs. Beaton's name has become associated with knowledge and authority on Victorian and Edwardian cooking and home management. And the Oxford English Dictionary, in fact, states that by 1891, the term Mrs. Beaton had actually become used as a generic name for a domestic authority, almost like in the 20th century, we use someone like Martha Stewart, for example. She is also considered a strong influence in the building or shaping of middle-class identity in the Victorian era. Mrs. Beaton was the queen of self-help writers. She was committed to not missing a single area of expertise in helping housewives keep their homes organized. As I mentioned, the 1912 edition ballooned to a massive 2,040 pages. And similar to most experts today, Mrs. Beaton's mantra was, which she articulates in the introduction of the book, is, and I'm quoting, "Cleanliness, punctuality, and method are essentials in the character of a good housekeeper. Without these qualities, no household can be well managed. Order, again, is indispensable. By it, we provide that there should be a place for everything and everything in its place." Sadly, Mrs. Beaton didn't live very long to see the success of her book and her name over the course of the next 100 and some years. She died at the age of 28 of puerperal fever as a result of giving birth. And so her husband continued on with the publication of the book. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a background of where this whole topic started for me. But then I kind of took a step back from Mrs. Beaton to really take a look at how I was going to kind of tie in what was happening in the world at the time to how that translates to the reality of someone who might have used Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management, because it wasn't for everyone, just like Martha Stewart magazine wasn't for everyone when it was very popular a few years ago. So let's start with how Canada fit into the world in 1900. Canada as a country at that time was really a country searching for an identity. There was really a lot of push and pull, which continued to be a constant. It actually even continues on to current day, where a push and pull between whether or not the Dominion of Canada identifies with the British ideals or whether the Dominion identifies with American ideals and an American alliance, since we're so close to the United States. And this idea of imperial solidarity. The Canada of the 1870s and 1880s, leading up to the turn of the century, was a country in flux. The population of about 5 million people was essentially 68% were living in the countryside, and the number of people moving to the city increased every year. So you can see here, for example, this is St. Catharines in just prior to 1900, and it's pretty much the country. It looks like the country as you would imagine it today. But the Industrial Revolution was changing the economic reality of the country overall. Growth and consolidation of industry and expansion of service industries were offering men, and to some extent women, different options for how to make a living. As historian Carmen Miller suggests, the telephone, typewriter, and new corporate and administrative structures were transforming urban work in ways in which workers often resented. Additionally, many of these new jobs required training and additional education, which created a shift in importance of institutions supporting youth development, such as schools, churches, and voluntary organizations, which helped to build skills and to make men into productive members of society, men and women, of course. I should go back, actually, maybe if I can go back. There we go. And let you know what this particular picture is. This is a picture of factories in Meryton, and actually you can see kind of the back of the Welland Canal here, and the Riordan paper mill is the one with the kind of closer to the front with the smokestack going, and there also is the Libster cotton mill there. Most of the pictures I've used in this slideshow are directly related to St. Catharines, even though the topic is a little bit broader in some places. This picture is St. Catharines collegiate class from 1891. So you can see St. Catharines is fully on board with this idea that education is very important and it provides better opportunities for the population living at the time. Compulsory and free state-run schooling was instituted in Ontario in 1871 and soon spread throughout Canada. Families hoped that schooling would provide an avenue for their children to make a better life and to be better citizens. So all of this was all connected to kind of identity at the same time. With the encouragement of Christian reform movements, a shift towards creating better citizens on earth with the final goal of a better place after death. Leading a virtuous life and being a good citizen became synonymous. Another offshoot of increased literacy was the influence that the printed word and the growth of ideological trends, or isms as we might call them today. These ideologies became more accessible to a wider audience. Imperialism and nationalism were some of the most popular of the ideologies at the turn of the 19th century. Canadians who advocated for a Canada as part of a united British Empire were encouraged by such activities as drill, demonstrations, patriotic exercises, historical reenactments, which all contributed to this idea of Canada's place in the world order. And this really fits into this idea of Canada as part of a larger empire and as part of the British Empire. And the school curriculums at the time supported these ideals. So those students that we saw in the last few pictures would eventually, hopefully, be a part of some of these larger organizations that did demonstrations that really kind of brought up this idea of the empire being the most important thing that you needed to support as a citizen. School curriculum also used popular literature and the books that children were provided as part of the curriculum to encourage in young men the idea of manliness, courage, adventure, and in women, this idea of supporting that and supporting the bringing up of the empire all around. As you may have, if you've gone back and watched the Boer War lecture that I did, you would have heard that authors such as Rudyard Kipling and G.A. Henty were incredibly popular at the time. And those books, similar to the boy's own book or the girl's own book, were really all about making better citizens for a better empire. And that's kind of where we catch ourselves as we are moving through Canada in 1900. The churches encouraged these ideals as well, and they really supported this shift towards empire building. And this is a quote from Carmen Miller again. In their churches where the flag, the Bible, and the English language seemed as indivisible as the Trinity, young men were urged to rid the land of evil and win the world for Christ in their generation. And as you can see in this picture, which is St. Thomas's Church, the Union Jack that is hanging over the pulpit at the front. And it would not have been unusual for minister in any of the denominations to be preaching from the pulpit political leaning speeches and speeches that supported the empire. Most of the Christian religions that were most popular in Canada at the time definitely would have been preaching imperial support in 1900. Additionally, the growth of patriotic and recreational organizations who supported the imperial movement provided an outlet for men and women who were experiencing social disconnection because of this idea that we heard about earlier on between the country versus the city. And so as the country overall, and St. Catharines is actually just a really great example of this as well, as it was moving from less rural to more urban development in the core, there was a movement of people off of farms and into the urban areas. It's not as much as you would expect, which I will talk a little bit about in a bit, but this created a little bit of a disconnect of who are we, what are we all about, and what is our life all about once we move to the city, essentially. And so patriotic organizations like the Navy League, the Boys Brigade, the United Empire Loyalists Association, the Orange Order, the Anglo-Saxon Union, different militia units, they all had a huge popularity and growth at this time period to help to support this, not just this imperial idea, but also this idea of how can people who are shifting their demographic situation belong in a community. And these provided, ways for people to socialize and to get together with, I guess, people that they believed had similar ideals, and also helped you to support and be a good citizen of your community. Of course, Imperial Unity was a very popular idea, even with business owners in St. Catharines and across Canada, and they saw this benefit of a larger market and the expansion of Canada's ability to secure credit. A larger market to sell the benefits of Canada as a permanent home. As you know, 1900 is just at the cusp of when the Canadian government is really pushing immigration into the West and to really fill out the West and create a new farming agrarian society in Canada. It also provided this opportunity for cross-empire postage, across the empire cable service, subsidies for transoceanic shipping of goods, and other international projects that could help to benefit Canada to be attached to other countries, especially countries in the empire. This is no different than any treaty making that you might see today. However, Canada, joined into this empire that already existed across the world. And in this map, you can see everything that is red is part of the British Empire, essentially. It's kind of an odd map. If you've seen this map before, most of the time, these maps with the red parts of the map and the British Empire usually have Britain at the center. And this one has Canada and Australia at the center, which is really, really interesting. But and Britain is kind of off to the edge of the map, but you can see all of the British colonies at the time in 1900. But Imperial Unity also had its detractors. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there was always been this push-pull, almost from the beginning of the history of Canada as a country, this push and pull between the United States sphere of influence and a British sphere of influence. And so there were detractors to Imperial Unity who didn't see the benefit of this political unity. Canada should be allowed to make decisions on its own and in its own best interests as a part of the empire. Even in 1901, even though this is 60 some years after Confederation, Canada still didn't have its own foreign policy, couldn't make its own decisions independently in the world. It was basically tied to whatever decisions were made by the British, and that continued even in the First World War. Canada did not declare war independently. It declared war as part of the British war effort. But imperial defense was also, so I talk about the war, imperial defense was a part of this contention of imperial unity. Apparently, Canadians have traditionally always been not super supportive of taxation that goes towards defense, back in the 19th century anyway. And so Canada welcomed British involvement in defense of our country, but they didn't want to spend more money on it. And really, if they were going to spend money on it, they only wanted to spend money on defense that was going to be domestic defense and not sending forces abroad. And Canadians were particularly supportive of British support in defending the country against the Americans who might potentially be deciding that they would like parts of the Canadian West or parts of even the Canadian East and Center. So those who supported imperial unity generally saw that this was a way for Canada to move itself forward as an independent country, especially on the foreign policy front. It didn't really act that way, but many people who were foreign or who were imperial unity supporters felt that way. And they thought that it would be kind of a great security blanket to support our country. But the general ideals behind the empire continued to enjoy widespread support from a large portion of the Canadian population, who continued to be predominantly of British background. And you'll see when we come down to closer to the end of my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about demographics in St. Catharines. And it was also predominantly of British background at the time. Again, according to Carmen Miller, British ideals provided identity and significance to the disparate, fragile British North American community after the 1880s. An example of how these ideas manifested themselves in the social fabric was through patriotic education. So, I mentioned earlier about education and how education really moved forward this idea of who we were as part of the empire. And imperialists had convinced the Ontario Minister of Education, George Ross, who was also an ardent imperialist, to get rid of all the textbooks that were not un-Canadian, which basically meant un-British. And to make sure that the Union Jack was flying at all the schools in the province, and to encourage students to write poetry and to write all kinds of stories that supported this idea of patriotism, loyalty, and praise of your country. And so around this time period, you also see all kinds of books and leaflets of poetry that come out of the public schools in Ontario, supporting this imperial theme and this idea of Canadians as, hearkening back to this British ideal of where we came from. And this is what creates this sense of self for Canadians at the time, and gives you this idea of I'm speaking in kind of a majority at the time. Who did we see ourselves as in 1900, and how did that eventually impact what your home life might have looked like? So this is a great picture, before I move on, great picture of an all-girls school, or an all-girls class picture at the St. Catharines Central School in June of 1891. By 1900, the Canadian Constitution was already 36 years old. Hard to imagine, but there were people alive that remembered the Canadians, fighting out for the Constitution and bringing in the British North America Act, which was hammered out in 1867. And while the basic tenet of Canadian independence from Britain was the British North America Act, it also was paired through the years with added legal precedents, ongoing legislation, and just general operational precedents that shaped the nature of the Canadian Dominion. The British North America Act was relatively vague with a lot of things, and ongoing legal challenges and cases that went before the courts at different levels, essentially. And then, of course, legislation at either provincial or federal levels really shaped what Canada looked like from a legislative perspective. In 1900, as I mentioned earlier, Canada was still a British colony, and our head of state was the British monarch, Queen Victoria, up to 1901. And then after that, Edward VII until May of 1910. And I've tried to stick kind of within that time period for the most part in this particular talk, although you'll see, we bleed out in one or two directions throughout the time period because just based on what we had in our collection, I tried to focus it to that. In 1900, Canada had a population, I think I mentioned this at the start of the lecture, of 5.4 million people, and they were living on a land mass that took up 3 million square miles. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how spread out the population could have been in Canada. But in actual fact, most of the population was really located along the border between Canada and the United States, in central Canada, which is Ontario and Quebec, and the Maritimes, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were a lot of population kind of in that section. And then there was a fairly good dense part of the population in the southern part of British Columbia by this point. And then the prairies were beginning to be populated, but it was by Europeans. Obviously, there were Indigenous people living in all of these places prior to that. So it was a fairly large landmass with people very, very kind of stuck in small spaces, essentially. So lots of empty space in Canada that mostly Indigenous people were living on. As historians Bothwell, Drummond, and English state in their book, Canada, 1900 to 1945, and this is speaking to the people living in Canada at the time, and I'm going to quote, their style of life was very different from that in 1867. The country remained rural, but much less so than before. As a result, Canadians in 1900 were less like each other than they had been. Some dwelt in those fabled Victorian homes adorned with gables and splendid, well-tended gardens, homes filled with delicate children, pampered cats, and low-paid servants who served capons on Royal Crown Derby as adults in the family sipped Chateau Margaux in Waterford Crystal. Others lived in sod huts on prairie ground, which yield its fruit grudgingly. And still others lived in slums in Canada's industrial towns and cities, end quote. Because of the differences experienced around the country, it's very difficult to generalize about the experience of Canadians in 1900. Luckily, there's the 1901 census that is a useful tool to shed some light on who the majority of the Canadians were in 1900, roughly. In 1901, only 34.9% of the population lived in urban areas. 1/3 of the workforce worked on farms, and the nature of the farmer had changed from the self-sufficient independent farmer, and many were moving to more specialized farming. Canada was still, however, a country of farms. There were a lot of farms in Canada. So, I should go back. So as you can see here, the reason why I've used this picture, although it's a great picture of the Third Welland Canal, what is interesting about this picture is the farmland, really. So you can see that we're close to St. Catharines as a community here, and yet it still basically looks like there's no city, essentially. So we're pretty far, we're pretty into the farmland at this point, even though you're within a relatively easy distance of the city itself. Also, according to the census, 27.9% of workers in 1901 worked in manufacturing and the construction sector. And this was actually less people than had been working in these sectors 10 years earlier in 1881. So what happened here? The Canadian economy was diversifying. And this was shown in the growth of the tertiary sector. And this sector covers a wide range of activities from commerce to administration, transport, financial and real estate activities, business and personal services, education, health, and social work. At the same time, Canadians out as a whole would still have considered their country a rural farming society. And because of the growth in the tertiary sector, that's part of the reason why I use this great picture of the Welland House, which, as you know, is on the corner of Ontario and King Street, and sadly recently burned down. But where that growth, or where the loss of the construction and industrial sector happened, people went into businesses like tourism, more professional businesses downtown like accounting, and working in the service industry, working in shops, those kinds of things. By 1901, the biggest challenge with the farming economy of the past was that large farm families existed and there wasn't enough land to keep independent farms for every single person in the next generation. So the average family farm size by 1901 had moved to around 40 acres. And because there wasn't enough room, so say if you had a large family with 5 sons, there wasn't enough land to be able to break that up to make a viable farm for each one. This led to a flow of young people from the farm to the city. And often, lots of times, that flow didn't just move from the farm to the city in Canada, it moved from the farm to cities in the United States. It was a huge ongoing challenge throughout Canadian history, has been this loss of citizens to the United States. In 1900, there were 1,179,922 Canadian-born people living in the United States, which at the time was the equivalent of 22% of the Canadian population. So that's a huge amount of out-migration from our country, and a loss of knowledge and manpower, really, man and woman power, what you would call brain drain. In 1901, 52.2% of agricultural capital was actually in Ontario, and 25.9% of it was in Quebec. So the 2 large provinces that joined Confederation at the start really produced 77.7% of all Canadian agricultural output. So you can see this is really before the real big growth of large scale farms on the prairies. And the majority of agricultural product in 1901 consisted of meat, dairy products, vegetables, and fruit, and also a burgeoning grape and wine industry in Niagara. And there was a large market for oats to feed all that horsepower that was moving people and goods around at the time. There was a very strong export market for Canadian goods, especially Canadian cheese and Canadian butter, which was sent to Britain, along with Canadian pork. Ontario pigs were also exported in large quantities to Britain. And of course, there was a huge market locally for grain to be used in brewing and distilling. Canadians like their beer. And so that market, that hasn't changed since 1901. But how does this relate to the domestic life and how people got by? Just an example is a simple invention. The centrifugal cream separator actually reduced the labor of dairying and shortened the hours, which many farm wives had to give to the task of making butter. Just as in the field, horse-powered mechanization had reduced the hours of work for the husbands and sons who were working on the farm. The cream separator, the Meteor Hog, the refrigerated railway car, and the transatlantic steamer all were helping to move progress forward for the Canadian people and to make life easier for them. Dietary habits were changing as well. People were eating more meat, butter, and milk. And ordinary people were better off because of these technological improvements, the ones we've already mentioned, as well as faster and cheaper transit, which we talked about from the steamer perspective, but also don't forget there is the railway as well, which is moving goods around. And then there's refrigeration that helps to keep things longer and make it easier for you to move things around. Pasteurization, of course, was a huge boon and invention in this period. And there was improvements in urban distribution, which helped to make animal products cheaper and safer to eat. And so that really helped to improve people's diets. And as an aside to that, Mrs. Beaton spends many, many pages of her book talking about meat and different ways to cook meat, all the different ways to cut up animals to be used for meat, and how you use all these cuts, and what to do with, what today we would probably call the offcuts, and how to make sure you get the most out of your product. So included on top of that, by 1900, gas and electric cooking was becoming more widespread in the cities. It would not have been something that you would have seen in a rural farmhouse. You would not have had gas or electricity for cooking for quite some time after this. And then, of course, domestic refrigeration still relied on ice from the lakes and packed in sawdust over the summer to keep things cool throughout the rest of the year. Canned goods were beginning to become more and more common, and tin food produced an element of variety for all economic levels. Some changes in 1900, though, were not always good. Infant mortality was up as a result of unpasteurized milk and unsterilized bottles. These were both quite common. And then, of course, our boon of tin cans providing a greater variety for your diet all year round also had the opposite drawback that sometimes tin cans could cause botulism because of the way that the canning process might not have been done properly, and so the food inside goes bad. And then, of course, tinned fruits and vegetables lost a large proportion of their nutritional value in the preserving process. And people have talked about that lots of times today, that canned vegetables aren't as good as frozen vegetables or fresh, for sure. And that in each part of the process, it loses nutritional value. So, while tin cans and tinning was very useful to help to feed a population who might not have been able to afford something else, it also meant that their nutrition was potentially suffering because of this. On top of that, white bread replaced the more nutritious brown bread, as much of the bran and the germ part of the wheat was removed in this newfangled roller milling process that was beginning to be used. But white bread was so popular, it still is actually. People love to eat white bread. They think it's kind of like a more upper class thing. But this really did impact the poor the most, as bread was a huge staple in their diet. Another ubiquitous part of Canadian rural and urban life was the mail order catalog and a cheap and efficient postal system which connected the different parts of the country from one another. According to Bothwell and Drummond and English, again, they say, and I quote, "These links provided the tentacles upon which both a national feeling and a national economy could grow." So it really took people who were living in disparate locations and made you feel like you all belonged together. Everybody was reading the same catalog, you had the same access to products, and we had a great postal system that could get you those products as soon as you needed them. By 1900, Southern Ontario was also wired up for telephone. And by 1915, St. Catharines had 2,300 Bell telephone subscribers. By this time, by 1900, telephone wires were densely threaded along the streets of Canada's cities, intermingling with the electricity wires, which were beginning to expand as well. I couldn't find a great picture of this, but you may have seen pictures in different places downtowns of, I've seen some great ones of Toronto, downtowns of different cities where there's wires just like almost like a spider web crossing all over the place, willy-nilly across these cities as new technologies were bringing electricity, the telephone into homes. And really, there was no real plan at that point. But anyway, that's not really what I'm talking about tonight. But electricity was still expanding at this point. Electricity still had enormous potential in so many areas of life, like transportation, lighting, cooking, refrigeration, etc. And in 1900, it was definitely considered the industry of the future. Added to these luxuries were things like vacuum cleaners, electric fans, phonographs that you could have now music playing in your home, as well as things that really just made life so much easier, such as piped in water and sewers to your home if you lived in the city. So prior to that, women had to go out with a bucket to the well and fill up their water and bring it in. At the same time, I'm sorry, this isn't a great picture. Photography was beginning to be incredibly popular, and it was actually moving into more popular usage. And so it was much more accessible to the average person. In 1900, a box camera like this, as you can see, could be bought for $5, and films of 12 exposures were bought for 25 cents. And this is what the camera itself actually looked like, which I found on this website that's linked here. And so Canadians were now able to provide a recording of their own lives. So you didn't have to go to a photographer to be able to take pictures that are more candid of the things that were happening in your life. And lots of people took photos of their vacations and, their families sitting around on the porch or in their homes. However, there are very few photos of the interior of homes in this period, which I found sadly disappointing. Found only a few from St. Catharines that we had in our collection here at the museum. There may be lots out there. If you have any and you want to share them, that would be awesome. But this ability of photographic technology to be more accessible to the general population really made it easier for people to take control of the how they put themselves out into the world. This also changed how newspapers looked. Photos began to appear in newspapers, and newspapers were also having their heyday in 1900. Sorry, there's a spelling mistake in this slide, but Canada had an astonishing nearly 86% literacy rate in 1901, according to the census, and Canadians gobbled up newspapers in huge numbers. It was so much easier to get the news. It came to you sometimes twice a day, and it was much more immediate, more sensational, and there were a lot of niche papers as well. And the cost came down because of the cost of printing coming down. And so special interest groups had a much easier time publishing their own news and periodicals. But what of St. Catharines, you ask? According to the 1900 annual report of the Board of Trade, the year 1900 was the most prosperous year the city had experienced in a quarter of a century. And this is typical of the entirety of the country at the time. We were in a great, really boom time in 1900, and St. Catharines was taking advantage of that. The general commercial activity and industrial expansion of the business world in St. Catharines played its part energetically and shared in the resulting prosperity. The Board of Trade goes on to say that the dry goods, hardware, and grocery, and most other branches of retail mercantile business exhibited a satisfactory increase, yet without any visible manifestation of recklessness or extravagance, either on the part of the merchants and dealers in carrying unsafely large stocks of goods or their customers making their purchases. So not only were we successful, but we were successful in a conservative way. We didn't overreach ourselves. Merchants met their bank paper with promptitude. Their customers manifested less disposition to ask for credit than formerly. Cash transactions on the best terms were the rule. You can see that the Board of Trade was quite conservative, and they are trying to sell St. Catharines as a place for you to invest and bring your business, because this is a great place to be. People pay their bills and they don't overreach themselves. And same scene here is the James D. Tate building, which was located on the corner of William Street and St. Paul Street at 23 to 25 St. Paul. At the same time, St. Catharines was a fairly compact community. As John Jackson and Sheila Wilson note in the St. Catharines, Canada's Canal City book, what we call the Bible of the St. Catharines history book, the country was very close to everyone. The built-up city was in the core and included both large homes, such as this one you see here, which is the home of Dr. Theophilus Mack, which was located at 165 St. Paul Street. But also more modest homes were in the core. Most people actually lived more modest lives without servants and carriages. They lived in smaller homes with gardens and maybe had some chickens or pigs and sometimes a horse. Many lived in boarding houses or roomed with single families. And if you were to flip through the city directory from this time period, you'll see that there are lots of people that are renting in homes or renting in smaller apartments. Some even lived in more dire conditions, in shacks with very primitive living conditions. An example of this, as quoted in the Standard by Jackson and Wilson, is William Street. This is a quote. William Street, which from its central location and connection with St. Paul Street should be one of the pleasantest in town, is in fact one of the worst. Its old shabby buildings and fences and the surrounding rubbish would disgrace any village, much more our beautiful St. Catharines. So even in the core, you saw lots of different levels of economic prosperity. St. Catharines still had that small town feel, though. Everyone knew everyone else. You knew your neighbors, you knew what their business was, and many local businesses had continued to be in the family for a couple of generations at this point. And so St. Catharines still really did feel like a small town, even though it was quite a large town at the time. And as I mentioned earlier, there was plenty of opportunity for social events, sporting clubs, church groups, and musical and theatrical entertainment. So even though it felt like a small town, you still had lots of options of where you could go when and if you had any leisure time. And of course, leisure time probably was not for the working classes who were toiling most of the time. As I might have mentioned at the beginning, the population in the community in 1900 was about 10,000 people. It was and continues to be the largest community in Niagara, but was also a popular tourist destination. It was a popular tourist destination. The majority of the population was of British descent, with a small population of African Canadians, which numbered roughly 200 in 1900. But discrimination was still common, and most notable was segregated schools. And if you're interested in that particular topic, we do have a presentation from last year, which I believe was from Natasha Henry, who spoke on segregated schools. And you can find that presentation on our YouTube channel if you're interested in that. So I won't go too far into that, but while we had open schools for everyone, there was still segregation here, and discrimination was quite common. But like I mentioned earlier, most of the population of St. Catharines, a majority, were of British descent, British, Irish, Scottish, but just from that part of the world. But there were also small populations of Germans and French, as well as citizens of Chinese descent, Jewish, Italian, Polish, Scandinavian, and Turkish origins in 1900. Large-scale immigration from Eastern Europe hadn't really started to really grow the community in that direction yet, but it would eventually change the demographic numbers as the calendar crept closer to 1914, and worldwide instability, as well as the opportunity for large-scale construction projects, such as the building of the Welland Ship Canal, would eventually lead to large-scale immigration of people into the country. and into the community here, which would really change the demographics significantly. But all the written histories would lead us to believe that the life for the average St. Catharines person was actually pretty good. It was pretty nice to live here in St. Catharines. Women's lives were easier than they had been a few decades earlier, but there was still, the usual thing that you would expect: cooking, cleaning, taking care of the family, etc. Most families did not have servants, and if you had a servant, you might only have one. It was very difficult almost throughout the 19th century for Canadians to get good servants, mostly because people didn't want to be servants. It didn't pay very well, comparatively speaking, especially by 1900. You could get a better job working in an office as a woman than you could working for a single family and having to do all of their drudgery work as well. But I mean, it wasn't easy if you were a woman housekeeper in 1900. You have to imagine that there's no screens on the windows, so bugs are getting in your house. Dust is everywhere, especially if you live in the city and there's buggies and horses going past your door often. So you're cleaning up a lot of dust all the time. There's cooking 3 meals a day, hopefully over a range that either has gas, likely gas, but potentially electricity, but also possibly a wood stove, which is also leaving dust in your home. And then you've got to haul water, you have to bake bread every day, you have to do the laundry at least once a week, etc., etc. So it was a lot of work if you were a woman living in St. Catharines at the time. But as John Jackson and Sheila Wilson tell us, on the eve of the Great War, the prevailing mood of enthusiasm and confidence in continuing growth was reflected in the president's address of the Board of Trade. And this is from 1912. The year just past has been one of unexampled prosperity in this city. Building permits aggregate the largest amount in the city's history. Increase in the assessment of the city has risen by nearly 1/2 of the total assessment of 12 years ago, which is 1900, which we have already been talking about. And they'd already said then that we were in our most prosperous time. The paving of our streets has made our city one highly spoken in this regard. There is greater pride displayed by our citizens every year in the beautifying of lawns, gardens, and whichever way we look, we find a happy, contented lot of people residing in our city. And I will leave it at that. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of life for the average St. Catharine'ite and Canadian in 1900. And I'm open to any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was wonderful. While people put their questions in the chat box, and there were a few comments and things like that we can review, I'm just going to conclude while we wait for questions and comments. So go ahead, everybody, and post your questions and comments into the chat box. Thank you, Kathleen, for that really interesting lecture. What a fun way to kick off the autumn series. That was really, really very interesting. If you have any questions or comments, as I mentioned about 1,000 times already, you can please post them in the chat box now. While we do wait, a few things to go to remind you about. Thank you very much, everyone, for our viewers tonight. Please do send us your support in the form of donations. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, as always, please consider making a donation to the museum so we can continue to deliver the high quality programming you expect from us. To make a donation, please call the museum during our operating hours at 905-984-8880. Or new this fall, as I mentioned earlier, you can now make a donation online via our ActiveNet portal. Woo! The link to the portal was included in our email reminder. Thank you very much. Your donation makes a difference. With our wonderful guests, as I mentioned before, we have now delivered over 20 lectures, and Kathy mentioned a few of them. The Boer War lecture that she gave, also the lecture about segregated schools, which is actually right second on the list in this little screenshot, with Natasha Henry, who is the president of the Ontario Black History Society, and she talked about racially segregated schools last year. It was earlier this year, sorry. And it was a wonderful lecture. So definitely check those out. You can find all of that on the playlist on our YouTube channel. We'd also like to remind everyone to please like, follow, and subscribe. Smash that subscribe button on all of our social media channels. Oh yes, don't forget that we are slowly uploading all the lectures to podcast as well. So if you wanted to listen to a lecture while you do your household drudgery, the podcast is for you. That's my plan. Go back and listen to all the lectures while I do my household drudgery, which I'm now going to permanently call all of my chores. Anyway, we're slowly uploading week by week our lectures. And as we add more lectures, they'll end up on the podcast. Of course, please follow us on all of our social media channels. If you aren't already, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We've got a blog on WordPress. Of course, we have our podcasts and also our YouTube channel. So we will see you next time on October 5th for a lecture with our very special guest, Andy Panko, of course, titled The Busiest Piece of Railroad in Canada, the Welland Canal Construction Railway. I'm definitely looking forward to that. We haven't had a train-related lecture in quite a while. This will be very exciting for all the train folks out there. The virtual museum lecture series is, of course, produced by the St. Catharines Museum and the Welland Canal Centre and the City of St. Catharines. Let's take your questions. I'm going to pop over to the iPad over here. So Kathy, Brian posted a little bit, probably right around, it's made me laugh, right around the cream separator. Brian mentioned, remember our Mr. McIntyre, Canada's cheese poet, who wrote an ode to the prize-winning giant cheese. Brian, I just have to say, I smell a lecture on cheese in the future. That made me think there is a giant cheese as well in Perth, Ontario. I'm from out that way, and I always laugh just because it's such a strange. I mean, it makes sense that it's dairy country out there, but it just makes me laugh that people would think about making something so big.
One thing I hadn't really known a lot about was the prevalence of the Canadian export market for cheese, that British couldn't get enough Canadian cheese, that we really were exporting a lot of cheese out there. So, I mean, clearly we were making a lot of cheese as well. And, you know, we still love to eat cheese here in Canada. So I assume it was the same in 1900. But now I want to hear a poem from the cheese poet.
That's right. Again, a lecture on cheese is definitely due. Brian also says that and this is for everybody, another good resource, of course, is the Canadian Home Cookbook from 1877. Another great resource, of course, if you can look for it online, you can get a little bit more of that. There's lots of questions about a lot of different types of buildings as well. A little unrelated to our lecture tonight, the YMCA and the old YMCA building and the Welland House Hotel. Well, guess what? There's a whole lecture about historic architecture on the lecture playlist. So I definitely encourage you to go. It's early on. It's from May, I think, or May or June of 2020. So definitely check out the earlier lectures as well.
I will try to find one of the old YMCA building that was right on St. Paul Street. In fact, the picture that is the picture for the When the World Changed lecture that's here on the screen.
Yes.
This trolley car is in front of that building. And so I'll see if I can find a picture to go with that shows it a little bit further out, and that will hopefully help our query about the old YMCA building on St. Paul. Not that they might be talking about the other YMCA building on
queen, right?
Yeah, that was
Ryan will
torn down
correct us
later.
if we're wrong.
Yeah.
Bonnie would like to know what do you mean by meat hog?
I think hold on a minute, let me find that spot exactly, but it's basically hog as in pig meat, pork.
Right.
Yes, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. That was a quote that was direct from somewhere. The meat hog. So there's like, I'm guessing that I don't actually know why you would grow or have pigs if you weren't going to use them for meat, but this implied that there was an improvement in the strain of animal that was being raised for meat in the pork.
Absolutely. It was pretty typical as well for Edwardian households, whether sort of semi-urban, like urban garden household, or even just a regular farm, to have a kitchen pig that would take on all the scraps, and then you've got bacon or whatever you need for whatever the calendar around pig slaughtering is. So yeah, that's very typical, and it probably ended up in Mrs. Beaton as well. So yeah, definitely the instructions on how to keep a kitchen pig. It's like the garburator, really, just to take all your kitchen scraps, which is so smart in terms of food waste. That could be another lecture, food waste. Brian says that he'd be delighted to do a talk on the cheese poet.
Yeah,
so
Brian.
I think everybody, we can announce a cheese poet lecture for the winter series. I'm just kidding. I'm sure we'll come up with a better title. But yes,
great,
Brian, you're on
for
the hook for
coming
cheese. I'm sure it will be filled with cheesy comments. There was a couple of questions actually about some programming as well. I have one question that I want to ask Kathleen before we wrap up, but there was a question just generally about spirit walks at Victoria Lawn Cemetery. Unfortunately, you missed them. The spirit walks ran the last 2 weekends, and we've wrapped up for another wonderful, successful year. So you can definitely look into the spirit walks next year. They run the 2 weekends right after Labor Day, and tickets always go on sale on August 1st. So definitely look out for the spirit walks next year.
And they sell out by August 5th or something.
They sell out by August 2nd. No, I'm just this year was a little different because, of course, our tours were very small. We only had 10 people. So everybody cross your fingers next year that we can have some bigger groups, and then they won't sell out as quickly. Or maybe they will. Who knows? We're very popular. No big deal. So my question for you, Kathy, to wrap up is, and we've discussed this many times before, so I know what you're going to say, but just for the benefit of everybody, my family, like, I knew who Martha Stewart was growing up, but we never even, I don't think we had anything of Martha Stewart's in our house, like none of her products, and we never tried to live up to her standard, whatever that was, in the 90s and today. So how successful were people, in England and perhaps in St. Catharines at achieving the perfect Mrs. Beaton life?
I would say probably about as much as you would expect people to be successful with any kind of following any domestic advice. So it was same with Julia Child. Like, not everybody was going to cook their way through Julia Child's French cookbook either. And I've made a number of the recipes out of Mrs. Beaton's book of management, and they're actually very complicated. One of the great things about Mrs. Beaton, which I didn't mention in this lecture, but is mentioned in the blog, is that it's the first time that recipes included the list of ingredients you needed at the top of the recipe and then the description below it. Mrs. Beaton was the first person to do that. But the recipes,
compared to like other recipes, which is like read 6 paragraphs of ingredients and instructions like this, and figure it out.
They don't actually have a list of all the ingredients you needed or
the measurements.
Yeah, exactly. So it's great for that, but I actually find the recipes actually quite difficult to use because I'm not 100 years old. I don't have that same experience of cooking in a kitchen in 1900, but I would expect that a lot of the ingredients that she talks about are things that would have been common in a kitchen at that period, but it's not common in a current kitchen. But I think people would have been relatively successful in some of the ideas that she had, which were, you should be clean and you should be organized. And if you're going to be a good household manager, you need to run it like a military operation. And I think that advice is likely advice that people would have been fairly, no matter what your level of economic life was, you could be successful at that particular part of it. But most people didn't own servants or own servants, didn't have servants. Sorry. But most people didn't have servants, and most people didn't have a huge house, and you might not have the same number of meals per day that she talks about, and even
time. Like, you look at some of the recipes that come out in the magazines today. Like, I don't have 3 days to make my own croissants, so like I'm going to the store or going to the bakery. You know what I mean? So like, even regardless of money, maybe time, especially maybe for the lower middle class or the working class, even if they did have.
Keep going. Sorry.
Even if they did have a couple of cents to spend on whatever, they probably didn't have 3 days to make whatever, like some fancy meal or achieve that sort of standard.
Yeah. There's lots of advice that I feel is like, it's aimed specifically at people who wanted to be upwardly mobile. So it's things like changing for dinner every day. So like, what class do you get to where you decide that you're changing your clothes for supper every day?
Some people change into pajamas for dinner now. So I guess people are still changing for dinner. It's just I
mean, I guess if you're really hoping to be part of an upper class, then that gives you advice on how to fit in better. But that wouldn't have been for everyone. It would have just been that some of the advice is useful. And then the recipes some of them are quite useful. One thing I should mention to everyone, which you may read if you go back and read the blog, is that only one recipe in Mrs. Beaton was actually written by her. All the rest of the recipes were taken from other sources. But the recipe for the soup for the sick room was hers. Which I guess if you have 16 siblings, it makes sense.
Somebody's always going to be sick just because of statistics. Yeah,
exactly.
That's great.
Anyway.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. And we'll see you on October 5th for Andy Panko's lecture on the busiest railroad in Canada, the Welland Canal Construction Railway. And now it's the awkward time that we wait for the stream to end, for the stream to catch up. All right. Bye, everybody.